She was excited to board her first-class flight, but when the airline staff denied her a seat, mocking her in front of everyone, they had no idea who her father was or what was about to happen next. The airport terminal buzzed with energy, travelers rushing from gate to gate, suitcases rolling across the polished floors. Ava Carter, a bright-eyed 19-year-old college student, stood near the check-in counter, holding her first-class boarding pass with pride. This was her first time flying first class alone, a special gift from her father, who had surprised her with the ticket after an exhausting semester. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, with her curly hair tied back in a ponytail, Ava looked like any other young traveler. But her name alone carried more weight than she realized. As she approached the first-class counter, the airline agent, a middle-aged woman with a sharp expression, Susan, barely looked up from her screen. "Can I help you?" Susan asked, her tone neutral but dismissive. Ava handed over her boarding pass with a polite smile. "Yes, I'm here for check-in. First class." Susan took the ticket, her eyebrows raising slightly. She glanced at Ava, then back at the ticket, her lips pursing. "This is for first class," Susan said slowly, as if Ava didn't already know. Ava nodded. "Yes, I know." Susan sighed, tapping at her keyboard. Then after a moment she shook her head. "I'm sorry, but there must be a mistake. We don't have any first-class seats available for your name." Ava frowned. "That can't be right. My father booked it for me." Susan barely suppressed an eye roll. "Maybe you should check with economy class, dear. First class is usually for—" She hesitated, then forced a tight smile. "A different kind of traveler." "A different kind?" Ava felt heat rise in her chest. "I have a valid first-class ticket. Could you check again?" Susan let out a dramatic sigh and called over her supervisor, a man in his mid-40s named Greg, who walked over with an impatient expression. "What's the issue?" he asked. "She claims she has a first-class ticket, but it's obviously a mix-up," Susan said, her voice low but dripping with judgment. Greg took the ticket and glanced at Ava. Then, without even checking the system, he handed it back. "Sorry, miss. This section is fully booked. You'll have to take a seat in economy." Ava's heart pounded. They didn't even check. They had just assumed she didn't belong. She was about to argue when a passenger behind her, a well-dressed older woman, muttered under her breath, "Ugh, always trying to get something for free." Ava's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't a mistake. This was discrimination. But what Susan, Greg, and the passengers around her didn't know was that Ava's father wasn't just a frequent flyer. He was the owner of the entire airline. And when he found out what had just happened, no one would be prepared for what came next. Jonathan kept his expression calm, though his mind was already racing. He had seen this before, subtle, quiet discrimination disguised as policy. Instead of arguing, he did something unexpected. "I understand," he said, tucking his boarding pass back into his pocket. "Would you mind calling over a manager? I'd like to discuss this further." Claire hesitated, her forced smile faltering for the first time. She hadn't expected pushback. "Sir, there's really nothing the manager can do?" Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "I insist." Reluctantly, Claire picked up the phone, speaking in hushed tones. Within minutes, a middle-aged man in a suit approached. His name tag read, "Daniel, Senior Operations Manager." Daniel looked polished but impatient, as if he was already annoyed before the conversation even started. "Mr. Price, I hear you're having an issue?" he asked, folding his arms. Jonathan smiled politely. "Yes, I was told business class is overbooked and that my paid seat is no longer available. But I find that interesting, considering every other passenger in this line seems to be receiving their business class tickets just fine." Daniel cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Sir, I assure you, this has nothing to do with anything but policy," he said. "Sometimes seats are reassigned based on—" "Based on what exactly?" Jonathan cut in, his tone sharper now. "Because if it's first come, first served, then why is my seat, which I booked weeks ago, suddenly unavailable?" Claire and Daniel exchanged a nervous glance, They could feel the attention of nearby passengers turning toward them. Jonathan decided it was time to end this little game. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out his phone, and made a single call. "Hey, it's Jonathan Price. I need you at the counter for Skylink Airlines Gate 12. Right now." He hung up, pocketed his phone, and waited. Daniel frowned. "Sir, who exactly did you just call?" Jonathan smirked. "Oh, just someone who might be able to help clear up this misunderstanding." Less than 5 minutes later, the entire energy of the airport shifted. A group of executives in navy suits came rushing toward the counter, their expressions a mix of panic and urgency. Leading them was Michael Hughes, the airline's vice president of global operations. Jonathan turned to Daniel and Claire, his calm smile never wavering. "Let me introduce myself properly," he said. "I'm Jonathan Price, CEO of Price Tech Solutions, and one of the largest investors in Skylink Airlines." Claire's face drained of color. Daniel visibly stiffened. But the real moment of reckoning was still to come. Because what Jonathan did next would shock the entire airport. The moment Jonathan's name dropped, the entire atmosphere at the check-in counter shifted. Claire's breathing became shallow, her once smug demeanor collapsing into outright panic. Daniel, the operations manager, stiffened as realization dawned. And the passengers who had been watching quietly? Some gasped. Others whispered amongst themselves, pulling out their phones. But Michael Hughes, the airline's vice president of global operations, was the most visibly shaken. He rushed forward, forcing a smile that dripped with desperation. "Mr. Price, I wasn't aware you were flying with us today," he said, his voice suddenly warm and accommodating. Jonathan remained calm, his confidence unshaken. He had seen this routine before, how quickly respect appeared once someone realized they held power. "I was flying business class," Jonathan said smoothly, holding up his ticket, "until your staff decided my seat was overbooked." Michael's face twitched as he turned sharply toward Daniel. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice now cold. Daniel swallowed hard. "It was a mix-up, sir. A simple misunderstanding." Jonathan folded his arms. "A mix-up? You never even checked my ticket. You just assumed I didn't belong in business class. I wonder, how often does this happen to people who don't have my resources?" Silence. Claire looked down, avoiding eye contact. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his face red with shame. But Jonathan wasn't finished. He turned to Michael. "Tell me, Michael, how do you think the board of directors will feel when they find out one of their biggest investors was discriminated against at their own airline?" Michael's face blanched. He immediately turned to Daniel and Claire. "Effective immediately, you're both suspended pending investigation," he snapped. Claire gasped. "Sir, please." "No excuses," Michael cut in, his corporate mask back on. You just cost this airline a very expensive problem," Michael finished, his tone sharp and final. Claire's mouth opened and closed as if searching for a defense, but there was nothing she could say. The damage was done. Daniel, meanwhile, stood frozen, his face drained of all confidence. Jonathan simply watched. For years he had seen discrimination disguised as policy. He had watched people like him get treated as lesser, as if their money, success, or achievements weren't enough to be given basic respect. But today was different, because today he wasn't just another passenger. He was the one with the power. Michael turned back to Jonathan, his voice syrupy smooth now. "Mr. Price, please allow me to personally escort you to your business class seat. And of course, your flight is now complimentary, as a token of our deepest apologies." Jonathan smiled, but it wasn't out of gratitude. It was the knowing smile of a man who had just exposed a major flaw in their system. "I appreciate the offer," he said, slipping his ticket back into his pocket. "But I won't be needing it." Michael blinked. "Sir?" Jonathan turned toward the crowd of passengers who had been watching everything unfold. He raised his voice slightly, making sure everyone could hear him. If I wasn't a billionaire investor, I would have been forced into economy today." just like I'm sure countless other people have been before me. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement. Others whispered about their own experiences. Jonathan faced Michael again. So instead of taking my business class seat, I'm making a decision. He pulled out his phone, typed something, and then turned the screen toward Michael. I just sold all my shares in Skylink Airlines, Jonathan announced. Effective immediately, I'm divesting from this company because I refuse to support a business that treats paying customers like this. The entire terminal fell silent. Michael's face went white. Claire gasped audibly. Daniel stumbled backward, as if physically hit by the weight of what just happened. Passengers whispered in shock. Some even pulled out their phones, live tweeting the moment a billionaire CEO just walked away from a major airline investment because of discrimination. Michael's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, to beg, to fix it. But Jonathan had already turned around and started walking away. As he did, a young black couple sitting nearby caught his eye. The woman looked up at him, her expression filled with silent gratitude. Her husband gave him a small nod, a wordless acknowledgement of what had just been exposed. Jonathan nodded back. This wasn't just about him. It never was. He didn't just refuse a business class seat. He sent a message that would shake the entire airline industry. And as he walked out of that airport, the headlines were already going viral. Billionaire CEO, Jonathan Price, sells airline shares after facing discrimination. Will others follow? Black CEO walks away from airline after first-hand experience of bias. Skylink faces backlash. This ends today. How one man's refusal to accept injustice sparked a movement. Jonathan smiled to himself. Because this was just the beginning. Have you ever faced unfair treatment while traveling? What would you have done in Jonathan's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more eye-opening stories like this.